The Queen of Spades by Alexander Sergeyevich Pushkin. The Queen of Spades signifies secret malice, the latest guide to fortune telling. In rainy weather they gather to play. To double, redouble, a stake was no trouble, they say. They did not find it hard to entrust to a card their pay, so no day of rain ever slipped by in vain, they say. That night their host was Nomarov, an officer in the Horse Guards. The long winter night slipped by unnoticed. Only after 4 in the morning did they sit down to supper. The winners ate heartily, the others sat there abstractedly, refusing all other offers of food. But then champagne appeared, and the conversation livened up, and everyone joined in. "How did you do, Siren?" asked Nomarov. "Same as always. I lost. You have to admit I'm unlucky. I play cautiously. I never get carried away. Nothing distracts me, but I just keep on losing." "And you've never been tempted? Never been fooled by a card that seems fortunate? I'm astonished at your self-control." "How about Herman, though?" said one of the guests, pointing at a young engineer. "Never touched a card in his life. Never once doubled a stake, but he sits with us until 5 in the morning and watches us play." "Cards hold a fascination for me," said Herman, "but I cannot afford to sacrifice the essentials in hopes of acquiring the superfluous." "Herman's a German. He counts the pennies, that's all," said Tomsky. "But if there's one person I can't understand, it's my grandmother, the Countess Anna Fedotovna." "Why? How's that?" people called out. "I can't understand," Tomsky went on, "why my grandmother never gambles." "But what's so astonishing," asked Nomarov, "about a lady in her 80s who doesn't gamble?" "You mean you really haven't heard about her?" "No, not one word." "Well, then listen. About 60 years ago my grandmother went to Paris and became the toast of the town. People chased after her to catch a glimpse of La Venus Moscovite. Richelieu paid court to her, and my grandmother assures me that he almost shot himself because she was so cruel to him. In those days ladies used to play faro. At court one evening grandmother lost a large sum of money to the Duke of Orleans. When she got home, as she was peeling off her beauty spots and undoing her hooped petticoats, she informed grandfather of her gambling losses, and told him to settle up. My late grandfather, as I recall, was a kind of butler to my grandmother. He feared her like fire. Hearing of these terrible losses, however, he flew into a rage, fetched his account book, pointed out that they had gone through 500,000 in 6 months, and that neither their Moscow estate nor their Saratov estate happened to be in reach of Paris, and flatly refused to pay. Grandmother gave him a slap on the face and retired to bed on her own to indicate her displeasure. The following day she went for her husband, hoping that this domestic punishment would have had its effect, but she found him unshakable. For the first time in her life, she went so far as to argue and reason with him. She pointed out condescendingly, thinking this would shame him, that there are debts, and that a prince is not the same as a coach builder. All in vain. My grandfather was in revolt. No meant no. Grandmother didn't know what to do. Among her close acquaintances was a most remarkable man. I'm sure you've heard of Count Saint Germain, the subject of so many wonderful tales. You know he claimed to be a wandering Jew, to have discovered the elixir of life, and the philosopher's stone, and so on. People laughed at him and called him a charlatan, while Casanova says in his memoirs that he was a spy. In spite of his mysteries, however, Saint Germain was a man of dignified appearance, and the most agreeable of company. Grandmother still adores him, and gets angry if anyone says a word against him. Grandmother knew that Saint Germain had a large sum of money at his disposal. She decided to appeal to him. She wrote him a note asking him to come and see her at once. The old eccentric came immediately, and found her in terrible distress. Grandmother described her husband's barbarous conduct in the blackest of colours, and ended by saying that her only hope lay in Saint Germain's friendship and courtesy. Saint Germain thought for a while. "I can do you this service," he said, "but I know you won't feel at ease until you've repaid the sum, and I'd rather not involve you in yet more worries. There's another solution. You can win back the money." "But, my dear Count," answered grandmother, "I told you, we have no money at all." "There's no need for money," said Saint Germain. "Be so kind as to hear me out." And he revealed a secret to her for which every one of us here would be willing to pay dearly. The young gamblers doubled their attention. Tomsky lit his pipe, drew on it, and went on. That same evening grandmother appeared at Versailles, en jour de reine. The Duke of Orleans was keeping the bank. Grandmother casually apologized for not bringing the money she owed, making up some little story by way of excuse, and began playing against him. She chose 3 cards, and played them one after the other. All 3 won, and grandmother quite recovered her losses. Luck, said one of the company. A fairy tale, said Herman. Perhaps the cards were marked, said someone else. I think not, Tomsky replied gravely. What? Said Nomarov. You have a grandmother who can predict 3 cards in sequence, and you still haven't gotten her to tell you her cabalistic secret? Not a hope in hell, replied Tomsky. She had 4 sons, one of them my father. All 4 were incorrigible gamblers, but she didn't let any of them know her secret, although it would certainly have been quite a help to them, and to me too. But this is what I was told by my uncle, Count Ivan Ivichel, and he swore it was all true. The late Chaplitsky, you know, the one who died penniless after squandering millions, once, when he was young, lost around 300,000, to Zorich, if I remember rightly. He was in despair. Grandmother always took a stern view of youthful foolishness, but for some reason she took pity on Chaplitsky. She gave him 3 cards to play in sequence, making him give his word of honor never to gamble again. Chaplitsky went back to the man who had defeated him. They sat down to play. Chaplitsky put 50,000 on the first card and won straight off. He doubled the stake, doubled again, and recovered his loss and more. But it's time we went to bed. It's already 5:45. Indeed, day was dawning. The young men drained their glasses and left in their carriages. The old countess was in her dressing room, sitting in front of the mirror. 3 maids were standing round her. One was holding a pot of rouge, the second a box of pins, and the third a tall bonnet with a flame-coloured ribbon. The countess had no pretensions to beauty, her own having faded long ago, but she maintained all the habits of her youth, still kept strictly to the fashion of the 70s, and took as much time to trouble over her toilette as she had done 60 years before. By the window, sitting in an embroidery frame, was a young lady, her ward. "Good morning, grandmamma," said a young officer as he entered the room. "Bonjour, Mademoiselle Lise. Grandmamma, I have a favour to ask you." "What is it, Paul?" "Will you allow me to introduce one of my friends to you and bring him to your ball on Friday?" "Bring him straight to the ball. You can introduce him to me there. Were you at N's last night, may I ask?" "Of course I was. It was very gay. We danced until 5 in the morning. Yelitska looked ever so pretty." "My dear fellow, what's pretty about her? You should have seen her grandmother, Princess Daria Petronov. Oh, but I suppose she must have aged a great deal by now." "Princess Daria Petronov?" "What do you mean, aged?" Tomsky replied carelessly. "She's been dead 7 years." The young lady looked up and made a sign to the young man. He remembered the death of her contemporaries was kept secret from the old countess, and bit his lip. The countess, however, greeted the news with considerable indifference. "Dead," she said, "and I didn't know. We were appointed maids of honor together, and when we were presented at court, the Empress—" And for the 100th time the countess repeated this story to her grandson. "Well, Paul," she said afterwards, "now you can help me to my feet. Lizinka, where's my snuff-box?" And the countess went behind the screen with her maids to finish her toilette. Tomsky was left alone with the young lady. "Who is it that you want to introduce?" Lizaveta Ivanovna asked quietly. "Nomarov. Do you know him?" "No. Is he a soldier or a civilian?" "A soldier." "An engineer?" "No, he's in the cavalry." "What made you think he was an engineer?" The young lady laughed, but did not answer. "Paul," the countess shouted from behind the screen, "send me some new novels, or another. Only, please, not the kind they write nowadays." "What do you mean, grandmamma?" "I want the kind of novel where the hero doesn't strangle either his father or his mother, and where there are no drowned bodies. I have a terrible fear of drowned bodies. Your kind of novel doesn't exist any longer, unless you'd like a Russian one." "A Russian novel? I didn't know there were any. Send me some, old boy. Please do. Goodbye, grandmamma. I must hurry. Goodbye, Lizaveta Ivana. And what made you think Nomarov was an engineer?" And Tomsky left the dressing room. Lizaveta Iovana was now on her own. She stopped her work and began gazing out the window. After a short while, a young officer appeared from behind the house on the opposite corner of the street. A blush spread over her cheeks. She returned to her work, bending low over the canvas. Just then the Countess came in, fully dressed. "Order the carriage, Lizanka," she said. "We'll go for a drive." Lizanka got up from behind her frame and began putting away her work. "What's the matter with you, old girl? Have you gone deaf?" shouted the Countess. "Order the horses to be harnessed at once." "Yes," the young lady said quietly, and hurried out into the anteroom. A servant came in and handed the Countess some books from Prince Pavlov Alexandrovitch. "Good, thank you," said the Countess. "Lizinka, Lizinka, where are you off to in such a hurry?" "To dress. There's time enough for that, my dear. Stay here, open the first volume. Read to me." The young lady took the book and read a few lines. "Louder," said the Countess. "What's the matter with you, old girl? Lost your voice or something? Wait, bring me my footstool. Closer. There." Lizaveta Ivanovna read 2 pages. The Countess yawned. "Enough of that," she said. "What nonsense! Send it back to Prince Pavel with our thanks. Well, where's the carriage?" "The carriage is ready," said Lizaveta Ivanovna, looking out onto the street. "Then why aren't you dressed?" said the Countess. "I'm always having to wait for you. It's intolerable." Lisa ran off to her room. Within 3 minutes the Countess was ringing her bell with all of her might. The 3 maids rushed in from one door, a manservant through the other. "Why don't you come when you're called?" said the Countess. "Tell Lizaveta Ivanovna I'm waiting for her." In came Lizaveta Ivanovna, wearing a cape and a bonnet. "About time, too, old girl," said the Countess. "And what finery! Whatever for? Whose eyes are you hoping to catch? And what's it like outside? Windy, I suppose?" "Not at all, your ladyship," said the manservant. "It's very still." "Think before you speak. Open the top pane. Just as I said. Wind, and extremely cold wind at that. I shan't be wanting the carriage, Elizabeth, and not going anywhere. You needn't have gotten all dressed up." And such is my life, thought Lizaveta Ivanovna. Lizaveta Ivanovna was indeed a most unfortunate creature. Bitter is a stranger's breed, says Dante, and steeps the steps of a stranger's door, and who can better understand all the bitterness of dependency than the poor ward of a high-born old woman? The Countess, of course, did not have an evil soul, but she had the self-will of a woman who had been spoiled by society. She was miserly and had sunk into a cold egotism, in the way old people who are done with loving and who have become strangers to the present day. She took part in all the vanities of high society, dragging herself along to balls where she sat in a corner heavily robed, and dressed in the fashion of an age gone by, like some hideous but indispensable ballroom ornament. Newly arrived guests went up to her with love bows and curtsies, and if according to some established ritual, and after that no one took any more notice of her. She still received the entire city, observing strict etiquette, and stout and grey in the maid's room, and her aunt's room, did as they pleasured, competing with one another in robbing the dying old woman. Lizaveta Ivanovna was a domestic martyr. She poured out tea and was scolded for using too much sugar. She read novels out loud and was blamed for all the author's mistakes. She accompanied the Countess on her outings and was responsible for the weather and the state of the roads. She was supposed to receive an allowance, which was never paid in full, and she was required to dress like everyone, that is to say, like extremely few. In society she played the most pitiable of roles. Everyone knew her, and no one noticed her. At balls she would dance only when someone was without a partner, and ladies would take her arm each time they had to go out and set something right in their dress. She was proud. She felt her position keenly. She was constantly looking around, waiting impatiently for a saviour. But the young men, calculating in their flightly vanity, judged her unworthy of their attention, even though Lizaveta Ivanovna was 100 times sweeter than the cold yet immodest maidens whose favours they courted. How many times, slipping out of the tedious and splendid salon, she had gone off to weep in her own poor room, with its papered screens, its chest of drawers, its little mirror and painted bedstead, and its tallow candle burning darkly in a brass candlestick. One morning, this was 2 days after the evening recorded at the beginning of this tale, and 1 week before the scene from which we have digressed, Lizaveta Iovana was sitting by the window at her embroidery frame, when, chancing to look out onto the street, she saw a young engineer. He was standing there, stock still, his eyes fixed on her window. She bowed her head and went on with her work. 5 minutes later she looked out again. The young officer was still standing on the same spot. Not being in the habit of flirting with passing officers, she stopped looking out, and went on sewing for another 2 hours without once raising her head. Lunch was announced. She got up, began putting away her embroidery frame, and chancing to look out onto the streets, she saw once again the officer. This seemed rather strange. After lunch she went up to the window with a certain unease. But the officer was no longer there, and she'd forgotten about him. A couple days later, as she was leaving the house to go for a drive with the Countess, she saw him again. He was standing right by the front porch, his face hidden by a beaver collar. Black eyes glittered from beneath his cap. Lizaveta Iovana felt frightened, not knowing why, and she sat down in the carriage with a quiver of infallible agitation. On her return home she ran to the window. The officer was standing in the same place as before, eyes fixed upon her. She turned away, tormented by curiosity, and troubled by a feeling entirely new to her. Since then not a day has passed without the young man appearing. Always at the same hour, beneath the window of their house, an unspoken understanding was established between them. Sitting and working in her usual place, she would sense his approach, raise her head, and look at him for a little longer each day. The young man, it seemed, was grateful to her for this. With the keen sight of youth, she noticed a quick flush pass over his pale cheeks each time their eyes met. After a week, she smiled at him. When Tomsky asked the Countess for permission to introduce a friend, the poor girl's heart had begun to beat faster. Discovering, however, that Nomarov was not an engineer but a horse guard, she regretted that her indecent question had let the flighty Tomsky know her secret. Hermann was the son of a Russified German who let him a small inheritance. Firmly convinced of the need to buttress his independence, Hermann did not even touch the interest on this sum. He lived on his salary alone, and did not allow himself the smallest extravagance. He was secretive and proud, however, and his comrades seldom had occasion to joke about his excessive thrift. He had strong passions and a fiery imagination, but his self-discipline severed him from the usual errors of youth. Thus, for example, having the soul of a gambler, he'd never touch the cards, believing that he could not afford, as he used to say, to sacrifice the essentials in hopes of acquiring the superfluous. Nevertheless, he would sit whole nights by card tables, following the ups and downs of the game with quivering agitation. The story of the free cards had affected his imagination powerfully, and had stayed in his mind all through the night. What if, he thought, as he wandered about Petersburg the following evening, what if the old Countess were to reveal her secret to me, or tell me those free cards? Why shouldn't I try my luck? I could be introduced to her, win her favour, maybe become her lover. That all takes time, and she's 87, and might be dead in a week, even in a couple of days. And what of the story itself? Is it to be believed? No! Calculation, moderation, and hard work, those are my free sure cards, and they are what will treble my capital, increase it sevenfold, and win me peace and independence. Taken up by such thoughts, he found himself on a main road of Petersburg, in front of a house built a long time ago. The street was packed with carriages, one after another. They drew up by the lit porch, and from out of these carriages would appear the sharply legs of young beauties, a boot with clinking spurs, the shoe and stripped stockings of a diplomat. Fur coats and capes fitted past a majestic hall porter. Hermann stopped. "Whose house is this?" he asked a policeman in a box at the corner of the street. "The Countess N's," answered the policeman. Herman gave a start. The surprising story presented itself once again to his imagination. He began to pace about in front of the house, thinking of its mistress and her miraculous ability. It was late when he returned to his own humble quarters. He was unable to get to sleep for a long time, and when sleep did overtake him, he dreamed of cards, a green table, heaps of banknotes, and piles of gold coins. He played card after card resolutely, kept doubling his stakes, and on, winning, ranking the gold coins across the table and pocketing the banknotes. He woke up late, sighed over the loss of his fantastic wealth again, and began wandering about the city, and again found himself in front of Countess N's house. A mysterious force seemed to be drawing him towards it. He stopped and looked at the window. In one he saw a dark-haired head bent down, probably over a book or some work. The head looked up. Herman saw a fresh young face and black eyes. This moment decided his fate. No sooner had Lizaveta Ivana taken off her cape and bonnet than the Countess sent for her again, and was ordering the carriage. They went out onto the street, just as two footmen lifted the old woman up and pushed her through the carriage door. Lizaveta Ivana saw her engineer standing by one of the wheels. He seized her hand. She was overcome by fright. The young man vanished. In her hand lay a letter. She slipped it inside her glove, and throughout the drive heard nothing and saw nothing. The Countess was in the habit, when they were in the carriage, of constantly asking questions. Who was that? Going the other way? What's the name of this bridge? What's written there on that sign? On this occasion, Lizaveta Ivana's answers were random and nonsensical, and the Countess grew angry. What's up with you, old girl? Are you in a daze? Can you hear? Or is it that you don't understand? I don't mumble. Thank God, I haven't lost my mind yet. Lizaveta Ivana was not listening. Back at home, she ran straight to her room and took the letter out of her glove. It had not been sealed. Lizaveta Ivana read it. The letter contained a confession of love. It was tender, respectful, and taken word for word from a German novel, but Lizaveta Ivana knew no German, and was very content with the confession. Nevertheless, she was extremely troubled by what she had done. She was entering for the first time into close secret relations with a young man. His audacity appalled her. She reproached herself for imprudent conduct, and didn't know what to do. Should she stop sitting by the window, and, through a show of indifference, chill the young officer's desire to make further advances? Should she return his letter, answer coldly and resolutely? There was no one she could turn to for advice. She had neither close friends nor mentor. Lizaveta Ivana made up her mind to reply. She sat down at her little writing table, took up a pen and paper, and thought. Several times she began her letter, then tore it up. Her words seemed either too forbearing or too cruel. In the end, she managed to write a few lines she was content with. I am certain, she wrote, that you have honourable intentions, and that you did not wish to insult me by a thoughtless act, but our acquaintance ought not to begin in this manner. I am returning your letter to you. I hope I shall not again have reason to complain of an undeserved lack of respect. The following day, seeing Herman approach, Lizaveta Ivana got up from her embroidery frame, went into the hall and opened up a little window, and threw the letter out onto the street, trusting the young officer's alertness. Herman ran forward, picked up the letter, and went into a confectioner's shop. Breaking the seal, he found his own letter, and Lizaveta Ivana's reply. This was as he expected, and he returned home much taken up with his scheming. 3 days after this, a quick-eyed young mademoiselle brought Lizaveta Ivana a note from the milliners. Lizaveta Ivana opened it apprehensively. "It's not possible," said Lizaveta Ivana, frightened by both the precipitedness of the request and the means used to convey it. "No, it really can't be addressed to me," and she tore the letter into little pieces. "If that letter wasn't addressed to you, then why have you torn it up?" said the young mademoiselle. "I could have returned it to the person who sent it." "Be so kind, my dear," said Lizaveta Ivana, incensed by this remark, "as to not bring me any more letters, and tell whoever sent you here that he should be ashamed." But Hermann persisted. Every day, by one means or another, letters arrived from him. They were no longer translations from German. Hermann wrote in the inspiration of passion, and he was speaking a language that came naturally to him, one that expressed both the intransience of his desire and the disorder of the unbridled imagination. Lizaveta Ivana no longer thought of sending the letters back. She revelled in them, and began to reply to them, and her messages grew longer and more tender by the hour. In the end, she threw out the window to him a letter which read: "There is a ball tonight at the ambassador's. The Countess is attending. We shall stay till about 2 o'clock. This gives us an opportunity for you to see me alone. As soon as the Countess goes out, her servants will probably leave their stations. The hall porter will remain by the entrance, but even he usually retires to the closet. Come at 11:30. Walk straight up the stairs. If you meet anyone in the anteroom, ask whether the Countess is at home. They will say no, and that will be that. You will have to leave, but probably you won't meet anyone. Go left out of the anteroom, and keep straight on till you come to the Countess's bedroom. In the bedroom, behind the screen, you will see two small doors. The one on the right is to a study, which the Countess never enters. The one on the left opens up to a passage, and then there's a narrow little spiral staircase which leads to my bedroom." Hermann quivered like a tiger as he waited for the appointed time. By 10 o'clock in the evening he was standing outside the Countess's house. The weather was terrible. The wind howled, wet flakes of snow were falling, the lanterns burned dim, the streets were deserted. From time to time, on the lookout for a late fare, a cabby would drive by with a scrawny horse, wearing only a frock coat. Hermann felt neither the wind nor the snow. At last the Countess's carriage was brought round. Hermann watched as the footman brought out a hunched-up old woman wrapped in a sable coat. Behind her, in a chilly cloak, her head adorned with fresh flowers, he glimpsed her ward. Doors slammed. The carriage moved heavily off through the soft snow. The hall porter closed the front door. The windows went dark. Hermann paced up and down in front of the deserted house. He went up to a lantern and looked at his watch. It was 11:20. He stayed under the lantern, eyes fixed on the hand of his watch, as he waited. At exactly 11:30, Hermann walked up to the steps of the Countess's porch and entered the brightly lit lobby. There was no hall porter. Hermann ran up the stairs, opened the door into the anteroom, and found the servants asleep under a lamp in an ancient stained armchair. With a light, resolute step, Hermann walked past him. The hall and drawing-room were dark, lit only dimly from the anteroom. Hermann entered the bedroom. Before a case filled with ancient icons burned a gold lamp. Standing in sad symmetry along walls hung with Chinese silk were down-cushioned sofas, their glit flaking off, and chairs upholstered in faded damask. On one of the walls hung two portraits painted in Paris by Miem Lebrun. The first was of a stout, florid man, about 40 years old, in a light green uniform, with a star. The other was of a young beauty with an aquiline nose and a rose in her powdered hair, which was combed back off the temples. Every nook and corner was filled with porcelain shepherdesses, clocks made by the celebrated Leroys, little boxes, bandeleurs, fans, and other ladies' playthings that had been invented along with the Montegall ballroom and Mesmer's magnetism at the end of the previous century. Hermann went behind the screen. There he found a small iron bedstead. To the right was a door to the study. To the left, the other door, into the passage. Hermann opened this door and saw the narrow spiral staircase that led to the bedroom of the poor young ward, but he turned back and entered the dark study. Time passed slowly. Everything was quiet in the drawing-room. A clock struck 12 in one room after another, and everything fell silent again. Hermann stood there, leaning against the cold stove. He was calm. His heart was beating evenly, as does the heart of a man who has resolved upon something dangerous, but unavoidable. The clock struck 1, then 2, and he heard the distant rumble of a carriage. He was seized by an involuntary excitement. The carriage drew up and stopped. He heard a knock at that moment. Steps were let down. The household began to stir. People ran about. Voices were raised and lights were lit. 3 aged maids hurried into the bedroom, and the Countess, half dead, lowered herself into a volataire armchair. Hermann watched for a crack. Lizaveta Ivanovna walked past him. Herman heard her hurrying steps on the treads of her stairs. In response, something like a pang of conscience answered in his heart, then fell silent. He became like a stone. The Countess began to undress in front of the mirror. Her rose-decked bonnet was unpinned, her powdered wig was removed from her grey and close-cropped head. Pins showered down around her. A yellow dress embroidered with silver dropped to her swollen feet. Herman was a witness to the revolting mysteries of her toilette. At last the Countess was in her bed jacket and nightcap. In this garb, more appropriate to her age, she seemed less terrible and hideous. Like a great many old people, the Countess suffered from insomnia. After undressing, she sat down by the window in her Voltaire armchair and dismissed her maids. The candles were taken away once more. The room was lit only by the icon lamp. The Countess sat there all yellow, twitching her pendulous lips and rocking from side to side. Her cloudy eyes showed a total absence of thought. Looking at the frightening old woman, one might have imagined that this rocking was effected not by her will, but by the action of some hidden galvanism. An extraordinary change came over the dead face. Her lips stopped twitching. Her eyes came to life. Before the Countess stood a man she had never seen. "Don't be frightened. For the love of God, don't be frightened," he said in a clear, quiet voice. "I have no intention of harming you. I've come to beg a favour of you." The old woman looked silently at him, and seemed not to hear him. Herman thought she was deaf, bent down over her ear, and said the same thing again. The old woman remained silent. "You have the power," Herman went on, "at no cost to yourself, to make me a happy man. I know you can guess 3 cards in sequence." He stopped. The Countess, it seemed, had understood what was being asked of her. It seemed she was trying to find words for an answer. "That was a joke," she said at last. "I swear to you, it was a joke." "This is no joking matter," Herman replied crossly. "Remember Chaplitsky, how you helped him win back his losses." The Countess was visibly perturbed. Her features registered a strong movement of the soul, but she quickly fell back into her former apathy. "Can you?" Herman went on. "Tell me those 3 true cards." The Countess remained silent. Herman went on. "For whom are you keeping your secret? For your grandchildren? They're rich anyway, they don't know the value of money. Your 3 cards can't help a spendthrift. He who doesn't look after his patrimony will die in poverty. The devil himself can't change that. I'm not a spendthrift. I know the value of money. Your 3 cards will not be wasted on me." "Well," he waited, quivered for her answer. The Countess said nothing. Herman fell to his knees. "If ever," he said, "your heart has known the feeling of love, if you can remember its ecstasies, if you have ever smiled at the cry of a newborn son, if anything human has a tiny stir in your breast, then I implore you by your feelings, as a wife, as a mistress, as a mother, and by all that is sacred in life, do not refuse me what I ask. Tell me your secret. What use is it to you? Maybe it's linked to some terrible sin, to the loss of eternal bliss, to a diabolical pact. Think you're old. You don't have long to live, and I'm willing to take your sin upon my own soul. Only tell me your secret. Think! A man's happiness lies in your hands. Not only I, but my children, my grandchildren, my great-grandchildren will bless your memory and hold it sacred." The old woman answered not a word. Herman stood. "Old witch!" he said through clenched teeth. "Then I shall force you to answer." With these words he drew a pistol from his pocket. Seeing the pistol, the Countess for the second time showed strong feeling. She nodded her head and raised one hand as if shielding herself from the shot, and then she fell back and remained motionless. "Don't be childish," said Herman, taking her by the hand. "I'm asking for the last time. Will you tell me the 3 cards? Yes or no?" The Countess did not answer. Herman realized she was dead. Lizaveta Ivanovna was sitting in her room, still in her ball gown, plunged deep in thought. On returning home, she had been quick to dismiss the sleepy maid who reluctantly offered her services. She said she would undress on her own, and went quivering to her room, hoping to find Herman, and wanting not to find him. One glance was enough to assure her of his absence, and she thanked fate for the obstacle that had prevented their tryst. She sat down without undressing, and began to recall all the circumstances that had enticed her to such a great distance in such a short time. It was not yet 3 weeks since she had first through the window seen this young man, and she was already corresponding with him, and she had yielded to his demand for a nocturnal tryst. She knew his name only because of some of his letters were signed. She had never spoken to him, never heard his voice, never heard anything about him, until this evening. It was strange. This evening at the ball, Tomsky, in a huff with the young Princess Paulina, who had been flirting for once with someone other than him, had wanted to avenge himself for a show of indifference. He had taken Lizette Ivana and danced an endless mazurka with her. All through it he teased her about her liking for engineers. He assured her that he knew a great deal more than she might imagine, and some of his jokes were so near the mark that Elizaveta Ivana more than once thought he knew her secret. "Who have you learned all this from?" she asked, laughing. "From a most remarkable fellow," Tomsky replied. "A friend of someone you know." "And who is that remarkable fellow?" "His name is Herman." Lizaveta Ivana said nothing, but her hands and feet turned to ice. "This Herman," Tomsky went on, "is a truly romantic figure. He has the profile of Napoleon, and the soul of Mephistopheles. Weighing on his conscience, I believe, are at least 3 evil deeds." "How pale you've gone." "I've got a headache. So what did you learn from this Herman, or whatever his name is?" "Herman is most annoyed with his friend. Were he in his friend's place, he says, he would act quite differently. I even think Herman has designs on you himself. At the very least, he seems far from indifferent when he listens to the enormous outpouring of his friends." "But where has he seen me?" "In church, perhaps. Or when you're out and about. God knows. Perhaps while you were asleep in your room. I wouldn't put it past him." 3 ladies came up to them with the question oubli or regret, cutting short a conversation that Elizaveta Ivana was finding unbearably fascinating. Tomsky's new partner was the Princess Paulina, dancing one more time around the room and spinning round one more time in front of her chair. She managed to make her peace with him. By the time he returned to his place, Tomsky was no longer thinking of Herman or of Lizaveta Ivana. Lizaveta Ivana had desperately wanted to renew the interrupted conversation, but the mamushka had come to an end, and soon afterwards the old countess had taken her leave. Tomsky's words were mere ballroom chatter, but they had sunk deep into the soul of the young dreamer. The portrait sketched by Tomsky was similar to the image she had formed herself, and thanks to the latest novels, this already hackneyed figure frightened and captivated her imagination. She sat in her room, her bare arms crossed on her head, still adorned with flowers, bent down over her breast. Suddenly the door opened and Herman came in. She quivered. "Where have you been?" she asked in a frightened whisper. "In the old countess's bedroom," said Herman. "I've just left her. The countess is dead." "My God, what are you saying?" "And I seem," Herman went on, "to have been the one that caused her death." Lizaveta Ivana looked at him, and her soul echoed Tomsky's words. On his conscience are at least 3 evil deeds. Herman sat down beside her on the window seat and told her everything. Lizaveta Ivana listened to him in horror. So the passionate letters, the ardent demands, the audacious, persistent pursuit, all this had not been love. What his soul craved was money. She herself was no power to assuage his desire and make him happy. The poor ward had been nothing but a blind accomplice to a brigand, to the murderer of her aged benefactress. She wept bitterly in her belated anguish. Herman watched her in silence. He too was in torment, but what troubled his stern soul was neither the poor girl's tears nor the surprising charm of her grief, nor did he feel any pang of conscience at the thought of the old woman's death. Only one thing appalled him, the irrevocable loss of a secret that was to have brought him wealth. "You monster," said Lizaveta Ivana at last. "I didn't want her to die," said Herman. "My pistol is not loaded." They fell silent. Day was breaking. Lizaveta Ivana extinguished the candle now burning down. Pale light illuminated her room. She wiped the tears from her eyes and glanced up at Herman. He was sitting on the window seat, arms folded, frowning grimly. In this pose he looked astonishingly like a portrait of Napoleon. The likeness amazed even Lizaveta Ivana. "How are you going to leave the house?" said Lizaveta Ivana at last. "I'd meant to take you down the secret staircase, but that means going through the Countess's bedroom, and I'm frightened. Tell me how to find the secret staircase. I must leave." Lizaveta Ivana got up and took a key from her chest, handed it to Herman, and gave him detailed instructions. Herman pressed her cold, unresponsive hand, kissed her bowed head, and left. He went down the spiral staircase and once again entered the Countess's bedroom. The dead old woman sat there, turned to stone. Her face expressed a deep calm. Herman stopped in front of her. He looked at her for a long time, as if waiting to be sure of the terrible truth. At last he entered the study, felt behind the wall hangings till he found the door, and began to descend a dark staircase, troubled by strange feelings. Up this same staircase Herman was thinking. Perhaps 60 years before, at the same hour, his hair coiffeured l'Alonze le Royal, wearing an embroidered coat and pressing his free-quartered hat to his heart, a fortunate young man, now long rotted away in his grave, had crept to the same bedroom today, and the heart of his aged mistress had ceased to beat. At the foot of the staircase, Herman came to a door, which he unlocked with the key, and he found himself in a passage that led him out onto the street. 3 days after the fateful night, at 9 o'clock in the morning, Herman set out for the convent where the funeral rites for the body of the deceased countess were to be sung. Though unrepentant, he could not altogether silence the voice of his conscience, which kept repeating, "You are the old woman's murderer." Having little true faith, he had a great number of superstitions. He believed that the dead countess might have an evil influence on his life, and he had the resolve to attend her funeral and so win her forgiveness. The church was full. Herman could barely make his way through the crowd of people. The coffin stood in opulent catafalque under a velvet canopy. The deceased lay with her arms folded across her breast, in a lace cap and a white satin dress. Around the coffin stood her household, the servants holding candles and wearing black catafans, with the family crest sewn onto the shoulder. The relatives, children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren, all in deep mourning. No one wept. Tears would have been un affection. The countess was so very old that her death could not have been a surprise to anyone, and her family had long seen her as someone from another era. A young bishop gave the funeral address. In simple and moving words he described the peaceful dormation of a righteous woman whose long years had been quiet, touching preparation for a Christian end. The angel of death discovered her, he said, vigilant in piousness, fought and waiting for the midnight bridegroom. The service was conducted with sad decorum. The relatives were first to go up and take leave of the body. They were followed by the Countess's numerous guests who had come to pay their respects to one who for so long had been a part of their vain merriments. Next came the household servants, last of all the old retainers. A woman the same age as the deceased went up to the coffin. Two young girls supported her, each taking an arm. She did not have the strength to bow down to the ground, and she alone shed tears as she kissed the cold hand of her mistress. After her, Herman summoned his resolve to go up to the coffin. He bent down to the ground and prostrated himself for several minutes on the cold floor, which was strewn with sprigs of fir. Finally, pale as a deceased, he got to his feet, climbed the steps of the catafalque, and bent down towards her. At that moment it seemed to him the dead woman screwed up one eye and gave him a mocking wink. Herman stepped quickly backwards, lost his footing, and crashed to the ground flat on his back. He was helped to his feet. At the same time, Lizaveta Ivana was carried out of the church in a faint. The solemnity of the sombre rite was disturbed by this episode for several minutes. The visitors all began murmuring, and a gaunt chamberlain, a close relative of the deceased, whispered into the ear of an Englishman standing beside him that the young officer was an illegitimate son, to which the Englishman responded with a cold, "Oh?" All that day Herman felt extremely upset. Dining in an out-of-the-way tavern, he uncharacteristically drank a great deal in hope of stifling his inner turmoil, but the wine only further inflamed his imagination. Returning home, he threw himself fully clothed onto his bed and fell into a deep sleep. It was night when he woke. His room was lit by the moon. He glanced at his watch. It was 2:45. He was no longer sleepy. He sat up, thinking about the funeral of the old countess. Just then, someone out of the street looked in through the window and immediately stepped back. Herman paid no attention. A minute later, he heard the sound of the anteroom door being opened. Herman thought his orderly was returning, drunk as usual, from a nighttime spree. But he heard unfamiliar footsteps. Someone was softly shuffling along in slippers. The door opened. In came a woman dressed in white. Herman took her for his old nurse and wondered what could have brought her to him at such an hour. But the white woman glided forward, was suddenly in front of him, and Herman recognized the countess. "I have come to you against my will," she said in a firm voice, "but I have been ordered to grant your request. The 3, the 7, and the ace will win you in sequence, on condition you play one card in 24 hours, and that you never, as long as you live, gamble again. I forgive you my death on the condition that you marry my ward, Lizaveta Iovana." With those words, she quietly turned round, shuffled to the door, and disappeared. Herman heard her slam the door to the entrance room. It took Herman a long time to come back to himself. He went into the other room. His orderly was asleep on the floor. Herman could barely wake him up. As usual, the man was drunk. It was impossible to get any sense out of him. The door into the entrance room was locked. Herman returned to his room, lit a candle, and wrote down his vision. Two ideas fixed cannot coexist in a moral sphere, just as two bodies cannot occupy the same in the physical world. The image of the dead woman was soon eclipsed in Herman's imagination by the 3, the 7, and the ace. The 3, 7, and ace were always in his thoughts and on his lips. Seeing a young woman, he would come out with, "She's so slender, a real 3 of hearts." When asked the time, he might reply, 5 minutes to 7. A pot-bellied man would always made him think of an ace. The 3, the 7, the ace pursued him through his dreams. Assuming every conceivable guise, the 3 blossomed before him like a large and splendid flower. The 7 became a Gothic portal, the ace a huge spider. All his thoughts merged into one unchanging thought. How could he make use of a secret for which he had paid dearly? He began thinking about resigning his commission and travelling. In the public casinos of Paris he would wrest treasure from the enchanted Fortuna. Chance spare him the trouble. There was a circle of wealthy gamblers presided over by the famous Chekhnitsky, who had spent his entire life at the card table, and had at one time made millions, accepting promissory notes when he won, and paying his losses in cash. Long experience had won him the trust of his fellow gamblers. His open house and famous chef, along with his courtesans and cheerful manner, gained him the respect of society in general. He came to Petersburg. Young men flocked to him, forsaking ballrooms for cards and preferring the temptations of faro to the allure of philandering. Nomarov brought Herman to his house. They passed through a series of magnificent rooms filled with attentive servants. Generals and privy councillors were playing, whilst young men were lounging on damask sofas, eating ice cream or smoking pipes. In the drawing room 20 or so gamblers were crowded around the long table, which sat the host, who was keeping the bank. He was a most respectable-looking man of about 60. He had a fine head of silver-grey hair. His full, fresh face was the picture of benevolence. His eyes shone, animated by a constant smile. Nomarov introduced Herman to him. Chekalinsky shook his hand warmly, asked him not to stand on ceremony, and went on dealing. The round went on for a long time. More than 30 cards were on the table. After dealing to a player, Chekalinsky would pause, allowing everyone time to decide what they wanted. He noted down losses, listened politely to requests, and still more politely straightened out a card whose corners was being bent back by an absent-minded hand. At last the round was over. Chekalinsky shuffled the cards and got ready to deal another. Allow me to play a card, said Herman, reaching forward from behind the stout gentleman. Chekalitsky smiled and nodded his head, indicating his obedient consent. Nomarov laughingly congratulated Herman on breaking his long fast and wished him a lucky beginner. There, said Herman, chalking a number of figures on the bank of his card. How much, sir? Asked the banker, screwing up his eyes. Forgive me, I can't quite see. 47,000, Herman replied. At these words every head turned instantly. All eyes were fixed on Herman. He's gone mad, thought Nomarov. Allow me to observe, Chekalitsky said, with his same unchanging smile, that your stake is very high. Until now, no one has placed an initial stake of more than 275. What of it? Replied Herman. Will you play against my card or not? Chekalitsky bowed with the same air of humble compliance. I merely wish to point out, he said, that being honoured with the trust of my fellows, I can pay only against ready cash. For my own part, of course, I am confident that your word is enough, but for the sake of clarity in our reckonings and the conduct of the game, I must ask you to place your money on the card. Herman took a banknote out of his pocket and handed it to Chekalitsky, who, after a quick glance at it, placed it on Herman's card. He began to deal. A 9 to the right, a 3 to the left. My free wins, said Herman, turning over his card. The players all began whispering. Chekalitsky frowned, but a smile instantly returned to his face. Would you like your winnings now? He asked. If you please, answered Herman. Chekalitsky took several banknotes from his pocket and settled up with him and then and there. Herman took his money and left the table. Nomarov felt bewildered. Herman drank a glass of lemonade and set off back home. The next evening he appeared at Chekalitsky's again. The host was dealing. Herman went up to the table. The other gamblers at once made room for him. Chekalitsky bowed courteously. Herman waited till the next round and placed a card on the table. On top of it he placed both his original 47,000 and the previous day's winnings. Chekalitsky dealt to Herman. To the right, a knave. To the left, a 7. Herman turned over his 7. Everybody gasped. Chekalitsky was visibly perturbed. He counted out 94,000 and handed it to Herman. Herman accepted the money with the sang-froid and left straight away. The following evening, Herman appeared again at the card table. Everyone was expecting him. The generals and privy councillors abandoned their whist to watch such extraordinary play. The young officers leaped up from their sofas. The servants all congregated in the drawing room. Everybody clustered around Herman. The other gamblers let their turns pass, impatient to see how Herman would end. Herman stood by the table, about to play alone against a pale but still smiling Chekalitsky. Each unsealed a new pack. Chekalitsky shuffled. Herman chose his card and placed it on the table, covering it with a heap of banknotes. It was like a jewel. Deep silence reigned all around. Chekalitsky dealt. His hands were trembling. To the right, a queen. To the left, an ace. My ace wins, said Herman, turning over his card. Your queen lost, Chekalitsky said courteously. Herman shuddered. Before him, instead of an ace, stood the queen of spades. He couldn't believe his eyes, unable to understand how he could have played the wrong card. At that moment, the queen of spades seemed to him to wink and smirk. Herman was struck by an extraordinary likeness. The old woman! He cried out in horror. Chekalitsky gathered in Herman's banknotes. Herman stood there, stock still. When at last he walked away, there was a sudden hubbub. Splendid play, said one of the gamblers. Chekalitsky shuffled again. The game continued its course. Herman went mad. He's in room 17 of the Opakov Hospital. He doesn't answer any questions, and he keeps muttering with extraordinary speed. 3, 7, ace! 3, 7, queen! Lizaveta Ivana has married a very pleasant young man. He works in some government office and has a respectable fortune of his own. He is the son of the old countess's former steward. Lizaveta Ivana is bringing up a young ward, a poor relation. Tomsky has been promoted to captain and is marrying Princess Paulina. First published in 1834, translated by Robert and Elizabeth Chandler and Ogla Mearson.